Hello, colleagues at Lumen. This is Professor Eric Gilder, and I have been invited to be a plenary speaker along with my colleague, Mr. Sever Avram. And we developed this together, this topic, how to combat the conversion of individual pandemic anxiety into collective long-term trauma. As the abstract says, as a recent study shows, the new coronavirus has especially highlighted the way in which globally we live, work, and worship. In this context, many states have been pressed to reconsider their previous social policies regarding the social welfare and health care. We have witnessed and continue to witness the so-called transgression in terms of intensity and strategic orientation from profit to protection of life. At the social level has been generated, at least potentially, a reduction in social inequalities. In economic terms, there's been considerable changes. These have sometimes been so shocking that the very definition and role of markets have undergone a process of redefining, and some have even invoked a possible end of capitalism as we know it. COVID-19 has revealed in itself the deficiencies in our existing system. The first section, we're dealing with a significant parallel between the manifestations, the effects of the pandemic, and the seemingly paradoxical increase in the appetite of readers and spectators of artistic creations that inspire, revolve around components related to imaginary or real pandemic. An explanation given within the article Apocalyptic Fiction, published by the Conversation blog, claims that pandemics are likely to frighten us, at least in part because they lead to at least less concrete transformation of the fears concerning globalization, cultural change, and community identity into so-called tangible threats. The representatives who circulate such images or metaphorics reflected at the global level claim that epidemics will be able to allow both authors and readers the opportunity to explore the non-medical dimensions of the fears associated with contagious disease. Pandemic fiction would not give readers a perfect look into the future. However, such narratives about contagious diseases surprisingly open a window to our deepest and most inward fears about our present moment, and are also able to explore these things. There's a long list of such fiction works that do that. The fiction works are not all not all capable or meant to prophesy the future situation after the apocalypse. They are rather addressed to the present we are going through, as they can be read and interpreted as instructional manuals for an outbreak. Finally, it is worth mentioning that a fiction work could help us both understand and manage the potentially amplifiable complexity of the virus, as well as various multifaceted fears about the changes we have to make in our own communities and as in the world we live in. Section 2. It is significant to note that in most situations, such as collective traumas, as the current pandemic would be, including in the spirit of fiction literature we have already mentioned, there is subsequently and in parallel a remembrance of the impermanence of individuals in their condition, a message evoked by the Dalai Lama countless times. In other words, according to Harper, in a paradoxical manner, collective traumas are in line with the opportunities that major crises generally offer in the spirit of palingenesis, the myth of eternal return from ancient times. Specifically, the finding and deep feeling, sometimes shaking, of the fragility of life and the condition of individuals can lead in deep and cultural transformations. Therefore, it is probably not by chance the same Harper invokes the possibility of establishing a socially useful network among perfect strangers based precisely on a type of sacrificial love. In other words, there is also a positive dimension to be taken into account. This means that the suffering endured in the recent periods affected and even undermined the so-called Malthusian deadlock, which seemed to threaten Europe or Eurocentrism in its traditional ways on indeterminated future. Following the above-mentioned arguments, according to the same author, in parallel and surprisingly, there is possibly that civilizations in general, not only European ones, set up their own chances of radical transformation. and this in the spirit of so-called globally connected cities. It means that the masses would believe in the emergence of a transforming possibility in view of a common harmonization, but which can implicitly represent a time bomb attached to this radical type of transformation. Through the effects of the absence of adequate social mental training in the face of such collective trauma, there would occur the possibility of random globalization instead of universalization of empathy and a reasonable reaction, balanced in the face of major potential new crises. Globalization itself, unsupported by the pillars of sustainable development, such as combating rapid climate change and cultivating in parallel with the transformation, digitalization, and ethical empathy, could ultimately undermine the lessons that should be learned in the complex and painful experimentation following such traumas or pandemics. Section 3. From the point of view of the central theme of the article presentation, we will continue to focus on a deeper understanding of the challenges and risks arising from the consequences of the current pandemic, positioned in parallel with the reformist and remedial opportunities that rose and deserve to continue to comply with the SDG 2030 agenda objectives. Pointing out first, the current global crisis has revealed both in-depth strengths and weaknesses, which have a major impact on governance, social economic systems, and the quality of global leadership. And then the whole idea of coming up with social economic recovery plans that will hopefully not jeopardize the SDG achievements, with a focus on public health and education. In parallel, other components regarding equitable development are interconnected, which go well with the objective of promotion of clean and affordable energy. Another area of major opportunity is opening up for ICT as well as the digital economy. This is valid not only for digital and distance learning, but for also other aspects related to equal professional opportunities, promotion of entrepreneurship, the improvement of soft skills, and so on. Along the same lines, it can see that local authorities should be given new functional competencies in their governance of their cities in light of sustainable development. Regarding these transformational opportunities mentioned above, Mujari explicitly refers to the urgency to rethink and reorient the traditional development approach. Those that in the past have generated, those development projects have generated well-known negative historical consequences. Therefore, in the future, policymakers should consider it would be more welcome to focus on overall sustainability, which includes the above-mentioned components, those that ultimately lead to living in harmony with nature. Finally, it would be desirable to adapt on the fly to fully value online tools, such as to facilitate interdisciplinary interactions, as well as consolidate the most innovative aspects and with the most consistent impact, such as those relating to co-learning, capacity building, and co-generation of knowledge. Section 4. In the same time, or at the same time, following the quoted article in history workshops, it would be desirable to recognize that in many concrete cases, regarding the urgency to revisit lessons drawn from the more or less recent past, it seems that we have not much hope of clarification from the point of view of attitude and priorities that we're required to assume today. All we have to do would be to look at the so-called alternative strategies for inquiring the uncanny traits between past and present. Such alternative strategies will be able to put into practice a certain mediation, taking into account only elements that maintain a certain factual procedural validity. And these in turn give a possibility of reformulations, including at the strategic level, to prevent and reduce consequences that are difficult to manage. This would be the case in particular with regard to the recommendation of alternative ways of transgressing crises. Indeed, in recent terms, we have, as a recent study shows, the new coronavirus has especially highlighted the way in which we live, work, and worship. In this context, it is worth emphasizing that many states have been pressed to consider their previous social policies concerning particularly social welfare and health care. And the issue here is, as the abstract noted, about the ending of capitalism as we know it, and the deficiencies in our existing system are there. And there was also a lack of preparedness and resilience made evident with the pandemic. In other words, places like America should have been able to handle it much better than they did. In this area, it seems the intervention of the states and international organizations was inevitably necessary as they were forced, contrary to neoliberal policies models previously used, to inject money into their economies. For several years, this radical change had been floating in the air as a direct or indirect rivalry between the prerogatives of some governments and the growing influence of multinational companies had deepened. Initially, this is about attacking global warming and climate change in general, but now it's gone much more deeper into providing public health services. In the same context of this approach, it is worth mentioning there have been massive changes in the level of perception, attitudes, and practices regarding how we worship in church. We do it online now. And section 6. In order to gradually generate the needed social changes mentioned above in the needed critical stages of crisis, according to a study, many governments will be quite mimic and self-defensive in the spirit of reviving a difficult sovereignty of themselves, but to be globally implemented. In fact, many governments have faced the precarious dilemma of balancing public health and economic consensus. However, or further, we have witnessed a display of grotesque blunders and crass incompetence, especially under the Trump administration in the United States and in Brazil, under Bolsonaro, but also other regimes considered liberal or illiberal, such as Boris Johnson in Great Britain. In the meantime, paradoxically or not, various governments have more to gain from surveillance technologies as well as a process of accelerating the digital revolution. We should not be surprised then there's a significant danger in trusting the capacity for democratic governance of some states have emerged. Even epidemiologists have not escaped appearing as those who have actually acted in favor of policymakers, with more emphasis on so-called alarmist figures, which have been used to justify reality of various restrictive measures. However, as a positive consequence so far, the study notes so-called hermeneutical versatility of science, which will be intended to reveal in the future its reliance on epistemic assumptions. This would mean the use of competing methods that would both reduce the number of decision-making errors and dismystify science as such, including that of doctors who in the end are just people. The above-mentioned epistemic and methodological effects to some extent relativize the very credibility of the medical science and experts in the field in relation to the violence of the consequences of the health crisis. But besides that, the social anxiety seems to extend into deepening recession of social inequalities and polarization between North and South. In practice, this means the perception of effects is extremely differentiated between the rich and the poor. The later experience not only the anguish of illness and the accelerated death time, but also consequences more brutally and directly perceived. Just their incomes are decreasing, they lose their health security benefits, they suffer from social polarization and create more sources of conflict and antagonism than the pandemic itself. And a good example of this was the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States following the killing of a black man by a policeman. The emergence of such movements beyond the immediate cycles of emotional impact have already determined and may continue to lead to surprising upheavals. This could implicitly determine not only the epistemic level mentioned, but the wells of the ways of conception and historical positioning of majorities and minorities. Meanwhile, this could lead to the tendency of gradual slide toward possible counterfactual history, capable of essentially redefining the pillars of an entire civilization, or at least what is believed to substantiate it. How do we read our history? From this point of view, on the contrary, as far as the minority movements seem to rely on accusations brought against discriminatory practices and discourses. Instead, the majority groups have been generally accused of assimilating some ethnic minorities with women themselves only as scapegoats. The whole picture did nothing but fuel various conspiratorial currents that generally generate globalized networks. The composition of such networks is very mosaic, including, according to a side study, the most diverse types of preachers and protesters, from anarchists and xenophobes to anti-vaxxers and anti-5Gers. Concretely, beyond the spectacular dimension and social disturbances generated, the most serious risk would be related to the future of consistency and coherence of democracy itself as a type of legitimate political regime. The fact that more and more social groups tend to consider themselves part no longer consider themselves part of the system is somehow paradoxically counterbalanced by the rise of so-called illiberal leaders. These ones are consolidating their popularity used by other groups ready to invoke the threats to which they would be submitted simultaneously with the shaking of the very foundations of the old social order. In conclusion, we try to argue that we can speak of a vision, at least two main directions of systemic vision. The one which is ultra specialized, medicalized, or technocrized in terms of how to approach the consequences of the current situation. The second one, directly or indirectly, is subordinated to the so-called conspiracy theories, or on the contrary, the result of questioning the way democracy or human rights are exercised. The above-mentioned consequences also seem to influence the transformational currents applied by some international organizations and symbolic leaders in the meaning of a wise overcoming of the major deadlock imposed by this pandemic virulence. In order to identify a midline of approach and action, this implies it would be quite useful to rebalance perspectives that do not remain confined or enslaved into a unique way to design a realistic vision and related action moving forward. Thank you for your attention.